Hi everyone, today we are going to talk about the detrimental effects of prolonged sedentary behavior. What we'll cover is what sedentary behavior is, so what's the actual definition? What are the risks? Who is more at risk? So is there a specific set of the population that's more at risk? And also, can high levels of physical activity offset prolonged periods of sedentary behavior? So, first, what is sedentary behavior? So sedentary behavior refers to any waking behavior characterized by an energy expenditure of greater than or less than or equal to 1.5 metabolic equivalents. This is called METs. It's just a way to measure energy expenditure. We can really just think of this as sitting or reclining in a lying posture. And sedentary behavior typically refers to, like I said, sitting or lying rather than the absence of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Now, Americans spend about 55% of their waking hours, or about 7.7 hours per day, in sedentary pursuits. And older adults actually tend to spend more time in sedentary behavior, so about 8 to 12 hours per day. So again, what is sedentary behavior? We can just think of it as exactly what I'm doing right now, is sitting or lying down in a reclined position. And most of us spend a decent amount, if not slightly more than half of our waking hours in sedentary pursuits or in sedentary behavior. So what are the risks of engaging in prolonged sedentary behavior? So in examining the literature, I found that sedentary behavior has detrimental effects on many chronic conditions as well as potentially on mental health. I look specifically at anxiety. Evidence also strongly supports the fact that higher doses of sedentary behavior are associated with increased risk of death or premature mortality. Let's look into the literature specifically examining some of these things. First, sedentary behavior increases the risk of what's called metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of symptoms which includes glucose intolerance, insulin resistance, obesity, dyslipidemia, and then also hypertension, so high blood pressure. The first study that we will cover is a 2022 meta-analysis. Again, meta-analysis is a statistical analysis of all of the existing literature on a specific topic. And this research paper was titled Sedentary Time and the Risk of Metabolic Syndrome, a Systematic Review and Dose Response Meta-Analysis. The authors in this study found that compared with those in the lowest category of sedentary behavior, adults in the highest, which was 7.26 hours per day, and intermediate categories, which is 4.11 hours of sedentary behavior per day, these categories of total sedentary time were significantly associated with an increased risk of metabolic syndrome. So if you were in that highest category compared to the lowest category, and if you were in the intermediate category compared to the lowest category, you had an increased risk of metabolic syndrome. And the risk of metabolic syndrome associated with the highest category, those are that 7.26 hours, was an odds ratio of 1.71. And all that this means is there was a 71% greater odds that a person in this category would have metabolic syndrome. The researchers also noted that for each 1 hour day increase in total sedentary time, the risk of metabolic syndrome increased by 13%. The next study is a 2018 meta-analysis. Again, I tend to prefer looking at analyses. We will look at some individual studies, but the meta-analysis or systematic review is great because it synthesizes all of the literature rather than looking at any one specific study. So this was a 2018 meta-analysis by Richard Patterson, and it was published in the European Journal of Epidemiology. And this paper examined mortality risk and incidence risk of diabetes and also cardiovascular disease. They found that for low levels, so we say low levels of exposure to sedentary behavior, so not spending a lot of time in sedentary behavior, increasing the dose provided some detrimental effects, but up to a point. So for example, each additional hour of sedentary time up to 8 hours increased the risk of all-cause mortality by just 1%. But after this 8-hour time period, increasing, so every 1 hour increase above 8 hours increased the risk by 4%. So after 8 hours of sedentary behavior, each additional hour has higher risk of all-cause mortality. And this 4% increase per hour was also seen for cardiovascular disease mortality, but this trend started at 6 hours. So at 6 hours, that's when the risk for this specific type of mortality went up. And interestingly, TV viewing above 4 hours per day was associated with an 8% risk increase for each additional hour. So for each hour increase in TV viewing, there was a 12% increase in the risk of diabetes up to 4 hours. So this is for diabetes now. So every increased hour had a 12% increase in the risk for diabetes. But after that 4-hour mark, it only went up by an additional 5%. So different doses have different risk response. And this article actually included over 1 million participants. I think it was 1,300,000. I also found that sedentary behavior was related to anxiety. Sedentary behavior is associated with social isolation, non-communicable diseases, and then also sleep issues. All of these things may contribute to anxiety. A 2019 meta-analysis by Dr. Mark Allen found a 48% increased odds of having anxiety with higher levels of sedentary behavior, although dose responses weren't reported in this study, so I'm not positive what a 1-unit increase is in relation to. So in the previous studies I was just discussing, it's for every 1 hour increase in sedentary time, you see a subsequent increased risk in whichever outcome we were covering. In this article, it didn't exactly say what that 1-unit increase was in reference to. If it was in reference to every 1 hour increase, if there's a 48% increased odds of having anxiety, that would actually be quite high. So this was covering basically, is sedentary behavior detrimental, and what is it detrimental to? So all-cause mortality, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and anxiety were just some of the things that we looked at. Another important question is, are these risks greater for some populations? This is important because, so for example, I'm 32. Me sitting for 10 hours per day might not have an immediate detrimental effect, but if I was 65, maybe it has more of a detrimental impact. Or if I had a condition such as diabetes or cardiovascular disease, does that have an impact when in conjunction with sedentary time? So this next study is called the Dose-Response Association of Sedentary Time with Chronic Diseases and the Risk for All-Cause Mortality Affected by Differential Health Status, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. The authors in this study determined the effects of the appearance of diabetes and hypertension, BMI, and also physical activity levels on the association between sedentary time and mortality in the most sedentary adults, so in the highest group of sedentary adults. What they found was sitting time showed a dose-response relationship with cardiovascular disease, cancer, and all-cause mortality. Each 1 hour increment of sitting time daily accounted for an increase in the risk of these things. Now, importantly, when sedentary behavior was combined with having diabetes, having hypertension, having high BMI, the overall risk for mortality significantly increased. So sedentary behavior in combination with already existing chronic conditions is more likely to damage one's health as compared with just being sedentary alone. The next study, we're going to look at older adults. Again, I like this because you take somebody that is, in this case, it's actually going to be 65 or older, and you follow up after a certain time period, and you can see what kind of risks or what kind of conditions have developed. In this case, we're looking at mortality. So this was a 2019 review titled A Threshold of Objectively Assessed Daily Sedentary Time for All-Cause Mortality in Older Adults. A meta-regression of prospective cohort studies examined daily sedentary time and risk of all-cause mortality in adults who were over the age of 65. And data from this study included slightly over 36,000 participants. So again, this was multiple studies pulled together. Ages range from just over 66 to 79 years of age, and the follow-up period on average was 5.6 years. And during this follow-up time point, it was something like 2,000 adults passed away, or 6.1% of the participants in these pooled studies. And the authors found increased mortality risk became significant when total sedentary time exceeded 9 hours per day. And this puts a large portion of older adults at elevated risk of mortality since many of them exceed this number. The authors in this study also report that older adults show progressive increases in risk mortality as hours spent in sedentary time went up. So mortality risk actually doubled for those spending 14 hours per day in sedentary pursuits. So it's 9 hours was that cutoff where it starts to become significant, but becomes progressively worse after that. So if you have conditions that put you at greater risk of negative outcomes, reducing sedentary behavior is going to be particularly important. Or if you're an older adult, you want to make sure that you keep an eye on that to reduce your risk of overall all-cause mortality. The last thing that we will cover is, can high levels of physical activity offset the effects of sitting too much? So first, it's not possible to alter sedentary time without also altering time spent in some form of physical activity. So if I'm not sitting, I'm going to be moving around a little bit. Detrimental effects of sedentary behavior can, to some extent, be mitigated by engaging in moderate to vigorous exercise, but likely not completely. There was an interesting study published in 2018 in The Lancet, which looked at this interplay, or the relationship between exercise and sedentary behavior. They found that high amounts of sitting were only detrimental in terms of mortality only for the most active individuals. So this was those people doing 60 to 75 minutes per day of exercise. Although those who sat the least but also had the least amount of exercise still had a significant risk of death during the follow-up time point. So while this is a talk about sedentary behavior and it's different than simply not exercising, if we had to pick something to work on, it probably would be to encourage people to exercise. If they could replace even one of those sedentary hours with exercise, they likely would have many health benefits. So again, this study in The Lancet basically showed that if you are very sedentary, you need to exercise a decent amount to offset the effects of sitting too much, and that was about 60 to 75 minutes per day. The next 2019 study looked at age-related biomarkers in older adults, so they specifically looked at frailty and physical functioning, with a focus on both sedentary time and physical activity. The researchers assessed frailty status with tests such as a grip strength, chair sit-to-stand test, walking test, amongst many other tests. In this study, people were grouped into categories that included physically active and low sedentary, so I'm active and I'm not sitting too much. Physically active, high sedentary, so I'm physically active but I also sit a lot. Physically inactive and low sedentary, and then also physically inactive and high sedentary. And this last category had the most people, which represented 63.6% of the sample. So that's actually a lot of people who were inactive and sedentary. Those who were just physically active had higher levels of physical functioning and lower frailty than inactive and high sedentary people. But what they found was that even physically inactive people who were low sedentary had lower frailty scores than the inactive and sedentary group. So just moving around might have beneficial effects on frailty, especially if you are an older adult, and that is even if you are not highly physically active. So just some conclusions here. Sedentary behavior increases the risk of several chronic diseases, and it also increases the risk of premature mortality. Most adults do spend too much time in sedentary behavior. I would say be wary of spending more than 7 hours per day in sedentary behavior. Even lower amounts can actually potentially be detrimental. For example, increased TV viewing was associated with an increased risk of diabetes. I think we said something like 12% increase all the way up to 4 hours. Then it starts to taper off with about a 5% increase. If you're already at risk, you should try to do everything you can to reduce sitting time, which is actually going to be a little bit easier than including exercise. So we want to reduce our sitting time. Increasing levels of physical activity can also mitigate the detrimental effects of too much sitting, but this seems to be only the case at quite high doses where we're looking at about 60 minutes per day.